Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 164 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Gary Whitta. He wrote the screenplay for the post-apocalyptic thriller The Book of Eli, starring Denzel Washington and Gary Oldman, and also worked on the script for After Earth, a sci-fi adventure starring Will Smith and directed by M. Night Shyamalan. Gary has also written for video games and comics, and he also worked on the upcoming feature film Star Wars Rogue One, which unfortunately he is strictly forbidden from discussing. He recently used the Inkshares crowdfunding platform to publish his first novel, Abomination. And now, here's our interview with Gary Whitta. Alright, so we're here with Gary Whitta. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Okay, and so you started your career as a game reviewer. So just tell us a bit about how you got involved with that.
Yeah, I started. I started like way back in the 8-bit days of computer gaming. I was reading the Commodore 64 games magazines and playing, kind of Sinclair Spectrum and C64 games. I grew up in the UK, so I was much more a child of kind of the Commodore and the Sinclair computer game world than I was really Nintendo and Sega. But I grew up loving those 8-bit games and transitioned into the 16-bit era right as I was kind of leaving school and desperately wanted to kind of do something like this for a living. I know that I love video games. I really wanted to write, and it was kind of a combination of writing being the only thing that I had ever really shown any kind of aptitude towards in school, and also at the same time as a teenager, the only thing I was really kind of that interested in was video games, and I was tremendously inspired by the game magazines that I would read voraciously when I was growing up. That's what I really wanted to do, and I would type out these little mock reviews. It's much easier these days, of course. You can put your own reviews on your own website or create a blog or something like that. But it wasn't necessarily quite as easy to break into the print magazine world back in the late 1980s when I started. But I would write these kind of dummy reviews and kind of mail them out to my favorite game magazines, and someone eventually took me on and gave me a box of games to go home and review. And that's kind of really how it all started for me.
Was that PC Gamer?
No, that was Commodore User. So this was like 1988, and it was roughly around the time, some of your older listeners will probably remember this. It was right around the time that the 8-bit generation was giving away to 16-bit. So the Commodore 64 was kind of going away, and the Amiga was the new thing. We were transitioning from 8 to 16-bit. And I, as a kid, as like a 15-year-old kid, had saved up like all my paper route money and all my allowance to buy an Amiga 500. It was like the thing that I wanted. And I bought an Amiga, and I got it like, I think the first week that it was available in the UK. And then when I went to Commodore User to interview for this job, they weren't necessarily that, interested in hiring me. But when they found out that I had an Amiga, and I think they didn't have at that time have any freelancers who actually had one at home, and they had this big stack of Amiga games they needed freelancers to review. So it was really just simply the fact that I had an Amiga that kind of got me in the door with, like I said, they sent me home with a box of Amiga games to look at because they just didn't have enough freelancers with the hardware at home. So that was kind of how I got into the business.
Well, so that's a lucky break. I guess that's going to come back too when we talk about your screenwriting career. But,
yes, you will find that most of the things I've achieved have been pure luck.
But so, because I used to read PC Gamer though, so I'm curious to hear about that. How did you end up at PC Gamer?
Yeah, that came a few years later. So I started in '88, and I kind of jobbed around on various 16-bit game magazines. I worked on a magazine called The One, which was kind of a tri-format. It covered the Amiga, the Atari ST, and the PC, which back then was really just barely finding its feet as a games machine. I mean, I remember playing games in like CGA, EGA, even prior to the kind of VGA era, when games had kind of 16 colors. I remember playing, a lot of the very, very early primitive PC games, but there was kind of the beginnings of a market there. And around 1993, I guess, the PC games market had gotten to the point where it was considered viable for them to have their own magazines. And PC Gamer was launched, and I was hired to go work on that as, I think I was originally taken on as deputy editor, but then the editor left quite quickly after the magazine was launched, and I became the editor-in-chief of PC Gamer in the UK. That was in '93, and then around '96, I came out to the US, to San Francisco, to oversee kind of the launch of the American edition of that magazine of PC Gamer. And it was originally just meant to be kind of my my year in America. I hadn't originally planned to stay longer than that, but I kind of fell in love with San Francisco, with the Bay Area. And also secretly at the back of my mind, it was always, I'd never quite put away the ambition that I might one day write movies for a living. And I figured getting to San Francisco kind of got me, 9/10 of the way towards Hollywood, where I would need to be if I ever wanted to take that seriously.
Right, right. So I said I used to read PC Gamer magazine. I was a really hardcore PC gamer back in the day. And one thing that strikes me now is that it seems like, you go on Xbox Live or something, and it's just like this nonstop stream of obscenity from teenagers. And I'm wondering, like, when you were writing for PC Gamer, was gaming culture different? Were people writing you angry letters all the time like that? Or do you think gaming culture has changed since the 90s?
I was funny. I was just talking to someone about this the other day about how, like, I'm going to sound like kind of a grumpy old man here, kind of like Abraham Simpson. But I actually kind of miss the days when, what you would hear from the community was basically just on the letters pages of the magazine, and that was a curated space where all the crazy letters just kind of got tossed away, and you would only print the edifying ones. Now, of course, it's much more like the Wild West. This massive democratization of opinion that we've seen the internet give rise to is, I think, it's tremendous in many ways, but there is also kind of a dark side to it, and that's why we unfortunately now live in this culture where a lot of people just don't go anywhere near the comments section, and a lot of the major gaming outlets have had to either put huge resources into moderating their their comments and their reader feedback sections, or just shut them down altogether because they've just gotten out of control.
But you got plenty of crazy letters though back in the day. It's not like that's a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't think the internet has created the crazies. The crazies have always been there. They just now have a much more powerful outlet to make themselves heard.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, actually, if you type your name into YouTube, this video comes up where it's you debating some kernel about video game violence.
Yeah. I
was just curious to hear more about that experience from your point of view. What was it like doing that?
I try not to type my name into YouTube if possible. But if someone does that, yes, that video does come up. I'm kind of amazed that it's still there. It's kind of become a little bit infamous, I guess, in that I don't know how many people remember this guy, but Dave Grossman was one of these characters, kind of like Jack Thompson, one of these anti-video game, campaigners who for a while there was trying to convince people that playing video games turned harmless children into violent expert killers. And a lot of the mass shootings that we saw and continue to see tragically in America, but basically were the fault of video games. And along with many other people, have always thought that the argument is preposterous. And I was asked to go on Fox News many years ago and debate this guy. And like I said, if you type my name into YouTube, you can see it for yourself. I try not to look at that video, if only because of the terrible vest thing that I was wearing back then. It's just embarrassing to me now. But I was quite proud of my, I think put up a decent argument against Dave. I think that these people, whenever, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, whenever, we see one of these mass shootings or one of these terrible tragedies, people always blame the culture. They always blame the media. They blame everything except, it seems, the crazy degree to which guns are readily available to anyone in this country. And I think that's a bit sad.
Was that the only debate like that you did, or did you do any other things like that?
I mean, I've certainly been on plenty of panels and forums and things like that where I've been asked to give my opinion. I think that might be the only time that I've ever been on Fox News. And this was several years ago, I think, before Fox really had created the reputation that it has today for being, this very kind of partisan, agenda-driven network. I think it kind of was. I think it always was that to some degree. It's much more overtly that now. But yeah, even back then I went in there thinking that, the audience is not necessarily going to be on the side of my argument. They're much more likely to react to kind of the scaremongering idea that video games are turning people into killers than any other factor. And I just thought the argument was preposterous. I'm someone who has played video games for years. I used to be the PC Gamer Office champion of Quake 2. I was really good at Quake. And people like Dave Grossman would tell you that skill set of being able to kill people, with a mouse-controlled rocket launcher translates into killing ability in the real world. I've been to a firing range. I've fired, a variety of real weapons. It's nothing like sitting in front of a computer shooting people with a mouse. But the idea that it can somehow condition you, or somehow kind of make you immune to the kind of the dangers or the horrors of real violence, I think is slightly preposterous. And I think if we're trying to solve the problems of gun violence in this country, there are much more obvious indicators that we can be looking at.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that part of the reason you came to San Francisco is because you wanted to get involved in the film industry. So how did you actually break into the film industry?
So this goes way back. It's funny. I kind of had these parallel ambitions, and I always say that I've been extremely, extremely lucky to be able to, have these two separate careers where I've been able to pursue both of the things that I loved, doing growing up and wanted to do professionally. One was video games, and the other one was movies. And I when I was writing my first little dummy video game reviews when I was like 15, 16, I was also writing these really terrible movie scripts, without having any idea what I was doing. But I knew that I wanted to be a Hollywood screenwriter. And I never really pursued it very seriously. The video game thing, that career kind of took off for me, and I just, went down that road. And I thought, well, look, 1 out of 2, dreams ain't bad. I'm pretty happy to be doing this. Is what I always wanted to do. And, eventually became editor-in-chief of PC Gamer and ran that magazine for several years. And, the idea of doing the Hollywood thing kind of, I almost kind of halfway forgot about it. But when the chance came to come to America, it kind of resurrected that a little bit. And then what happened was, 3 or 4 years after I came out here, the company that I was working for that published PC Gamer had a terrible, terrible financial year. They got caught up in the whole .com crash that everyone else did around 2000, and I got laid off. And I had saved up, I guess, enough money to be able to live, very, very frugally. If I just ate kind of ramen noodles and, Chef Boyardee for a year, if that didn't kill me, I could pretty much survive long enough to try to bash out some movie scripts and see if I could really do this thing. It's interesting. Again, I always think that circumstances often, even what might seem like very bleak circumstances at the time can really, really work for you. I think that if that had never happened to me, if I'd never been laid off, it's entirely possible that I'd still be editing PC Gamer today, that I would have just continued to do, the very safe and comfortable, thing that I enjoyed doing. And even though there might have been a bigger dream, a bigger ambition out there, the idea of cashing in this very, this job that I enjoyed and was perfectly safe and was perfectly stable, to go off and do something that might seem, very crazy and unlikely to bear any fruit. That's just, I don't know if I have the courage to take that kind of risk. But my hand basically got forced by the fact that I was laid off. That and so I took that year, like I said, the kind of the ramen noodle year, and just wrote a bunch of movie scripts, and I wrote as many as I could. And the idea was that I'm kind of an autodidact. I don't do very well at all learning by reading or going to seminars. I tend to learn better just by trying and failing and learning from my own mistakes. And so I wrote a ton of scripts, each one slightly less terrible than the one before it, until I eventually had one that I thought, I wouldn't be totally ashamed to show to someone. And I sent them to, various managers and agents and, studios and producers and people that, accept unsolicited material from wannabe screenwriters, and found it, a manager, responded to this script that I sent and signed me up as one of their writers. And that was kind of how I got my first foot in the door.
Now, how do you find, if an aspiring screenwriter is listening to this, how do you even find those people to send your script to in the first place?
I still don't even know if there's an easy answer to that question. I will say that I think, I've not really looked into this for some time, but I do think it's much easier now than it was back when I started 15 or so years ago. And when I say easier, I don't mean like it's easier. I just mean that the resources are more readily available. There's a whole world now of screenwriting message boards and forums and support groups, and there's a bunch of really, really helpful blogs and other informational resources out there that will teach you or help you learn not just how to write a decent script, but then also, what to do with it after that. And you can find online lists and resources of companies out there that will actually accept unsolicited material from writers. Most companies won't. Like if you send your script to, Warner Brothers or CAA and you don't have any representation and no one knows who you are, they will literally just send it back to you unopened, or the email will just bounce back to you. You have to find someone that will kind of take you on and represent you, and that usually comes in the form of a manager. Like I said, I had a manager long before I had an agent, and that manager kind of saw, I guess, in the material that I had submitted, some potential. And what a good manager will do is not just try to, represent you and your work in Hollywood and also, put you up for jobs and get you work, but they'll also kind of mentor you and try to bring you on as a writer. And even if you're not completely the finished article, if they see the potential there for you to become one, they will take you on and try to nurture you a little bit. And that's what happened with me. I mean, when I signed with my manager, I don't think I was in any way ready for prime time. The script that got me signed is probably something that would never get made even today. But, there was something in it where, the guy that I submitted the script to said, this guy might have the makings of something.
Well, so now was it when they put your script in the wrong pile, was that to get your manager?
Oh, you heard this? You've heard the wrong pile story?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, what happened? And again, this comes back to the idea that, it's often better to be lucky than good. In my case, I had sent this script off to a management company, and typically what happens when you submit a script to anyone really is it's never going to be read by the principal person at the company or the decision maker. It usually goes through a whole phalanx of readers and people who determine whether or not this is something that is even worthy of the attention of one of the principal people at the company. So on a normal day, my script would have gone into one of those piles, and perhaps a reader would have looked at it and said, maybe not so much. The guy above me doesn't need to be troubled by this script, and it may have just been sent back to me rejected. But by pure happenstance, my script literally got put into the wrong pile. It got put into the pile that the company's founder and principal, would take home, like the cream of the crop scripts to read over the weekend and read, for consideration whether or not he wanted to represent these writers. And like I said, my script had just kind of leapfrogged all of those without ever being read, simply by virtue of being put in the wrong pile. And this guy called me over the weekend that he had taken the script home and said, I don't even know why the script is in the pile. There should be, some kind of coverage or, some kind of notes on this from the guy who read it. But I ended up reading half of it anyway, and I already know that I want to sign you. So again, I was just really, really lucky that, I managed to kind of, get through that, what normally would have been, kind of this vanguard between me and the person I was trying to reach.
Right. Okay. So then you wrote the Book of Eli, which actually got produced. How did that project first get started?
Well, so Eli didn't come. I mean, again, it's interesting how when you get your first movie made, it shows up in the trade papers as that writer's first project. Eli was probably, I don't know, like the 20th thing that I wrote, but people don't ever really recognize or pay attention to all the other scripts that you had to write just to get good enough to write something that might actually get made. But there was the script that I wrote, which got me signed with my manager, and then I wrote another script after that, which we managed to get optioned by a small independent company. And then I kind of jobbed around for a while, doing kind of small time rewrite work on kind of smaller movies, kind of B movies, and it's all good experience, and you get to meet writers and actors and directors and producers, and you meet with the people at the studios, and you start to get a sense for how to navigate this business and what it takes to really be a working writer in Hollywood. But Eli was just a spec script. It was an idea that I really wanted to write. I had spent the last couple of years prior to that, working on other people's movies, doing little rewrite jobs, trying to fix other people's scripts that were broken. And I don't find that tremendously rewarding or satisfying. For me, the most rewarding or satisfying thing to do is to come up with an original idea and create something out of whole cloth. And Eli was an idea that had been, just kind of bouncing around in my head for a long time. The idea of trying to kind of do like an old-fashioned Western, like a wandering, man with no name, almost like a Zatoichi samurai type movie. I've always been attracted to those kind of characters. And I wrote Eli in an attempt to try and, capture that idea. And send it to my managers, as what they call a spec script, which is a script that nobody asks you or hires you or assigns you to write. You're not getting paid to write it. You come up with the idea yourself. You write it on your own volition, speculatively, in the hope that once it's finished, someone might be interested in buying it and making it. And that's what happened with Eli. I wrote the script and we sent it out, and we had a few people interested in it. And Joel Silver took it into Warner Brothers and said, I want to make this movie. And, the story is actually far longer and kind of more roller coastery than the summary I'm giving you. But, the short version of it is, we were lucky enough to get Denzel, and the Hughes brothers were attracted to the material. And it was actually made relative for an original piece of material. You got to remember the speed of development in Hollywood is really moves often at a very, very glacial pace. Unless you're operating in the echelons of Star Wars or Marvel movies, where they're just those movies are getting made. We pretty much know those movies are going to get made. With an original piece of material, it can sit around for years and years and years and get caught up in all kinds of development hell and go through all kinds of writers before it ever sees the light of day, if at all. Eli, by that standard, was actually relatively fast. I think I wrote it in late 2006. We sold it to Warner Brothers in early 2007, and it was in theaters January 2010. So from beginning to end, it was a little over 3 years, which might sound like a long time, but by movie standards, it's actually staggeringly fast.
Right. Well, and so you mentioned that the premise is that there's a kind of lone wanderer in a post-apocalyptic landscape, and he has the last copy of the Bible that anybody knows about. How did that idea come to you?
Well, like I said, it originally started with very pulpy roots. I grew up on movies like, The Man with No Name, Fistful of Dollars, and Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I've always loved the idea of that kind of lone wandering hero. I grew up on Seven Samurai. And, to some extent, there's a little Obi-Wan Kenobi in there as well, because that in itself is obviously inspired by, Star Wars was to some extent inspired by, Westerns and old samurai movies. There is something, I think, very mythic about the idea of that kind of, that nomadic character, that lone wandering warrior prophet. And I originally had the idea for Eli as that kind of guy, but I didn't really have like a foundation for him. I didn't really know what the movie was about. And I'm not religious at all. It's funny, a lot of people who see the movie assume that I'm a Christian. I'm not at all. I'm an atheist. But I'm fascinated by the way that religion and spirituality and faith does motivate people. It's clearly one of the great, social forces in the world and has been for thousands of years. And I thought I saw kind of an opportunity to try through the very kind of popcorny nature of the movie. I mean, it is basically a kind of a good old-fashioned kind of action adventure, post-apocalyptic thriller. But I wanted underneath all of that for it to be really about something. And I was really attracted to this idea of having this conversation about whether or not religion is a positive or a negative force, and the idea that I arrived at, that I think it's essentially down to whoever's hands it's in. I was really motivated by this great old quote from the Alan Ladd movie Shane, where Shane says, a gun is only as good or as bad as the man who wears it. And I think that's true of, you can say that same thing about the Bible as well. There are people, you've got Mother Teresa on one side who kind of took her religious faith and turned it into a way to help people and be a tremendous positive force in the world. And then on the other side of the world, you've got things like ISIS and Jimmy Swaggart and these kind of people who have, turned religion basically into just a big confidence trick or an excuse to kill people. And so it's this incredibly, motivational force. We know that it really motivates people. Whether or not it motivates people to do good in the world or bad in the world is the conversation that I wanted the movie to have.
How did people like the various production people and people at the studio, were they at all leery about having a story with the Bible used like that, or what? Did it help the movie get made? I mean, how did that play out?
It helped. The irony was it helped the movie get sold, but then it actually became an obstacle to the movie getting made. And you see this happens a lot in Hollywood. I think with Hollywood, often the reach often overextends the grasp, which is to say when Warner Brothers first saw the movie, they were really attracted to doing this thing that was like, this is kind of, edgy and dangerous, and it's dealing with these controversial themes. And so they originally were really excited about, every studio wants to kind of try and do that and do something, that's a little bit out of the box or unexpected, something that's not quite so safe. And so they were attracted to this idea of this kind of gritty, violent movie that had these kind of religious, these kind of faith-based underpinnings. But then when the time comes somewhat later to actually write a check for $80 million to make the film, they look at the script again and go, this is kind of edgy and dangerous and controversial, and we're not quite sure about this. And what eventually happened was the studio, in fact, didn't make it. It's not a studio film. It's actually an independent film. Warner Brothers had the opportunity to make the film right up until the last minute, and we went to the green light movie where the head of the studio decides whether or not he's going to make the film, and they ultimately said no. And this is with Denzel attached and the directors and this whole package. The movie was basically ready to go, and the studio said, we're kind of having cold feet. We don't want to do it now. And so they said no, and we were back to square one, and we thought the movie was dead. And what happened was a company called Alcon, which at the time had just had a big hit with remember The Blind Side, the movie with Sandra Bullock, where she kind of adopts the football player. They were looking for this kind of material, and they basically came in and wrote the check themselves, and basically kind of funded the whole movie outside of the studio system. Warner Brothers still distributed the film, but it wasn't made as a studio movie, and that was actually terrific for us because it meant that once we were given, the budget, we basically had creative freedom to make the film that we wanted. Like the studio notes kind of went away, because there was no studio, and we got notes from the producers, and Denzel had his own thoughts, and we would, we would work within those. But it didn't really go. What we originally thought was, the death of the project, which is Warner Brothers saying no to financing it, I think eventually really helped us because we got to make the movie essentially as an independent film without anything like the typical kind of studio development process that you might see a big movie like that go through.
Huh. We'll say a bit more about the public response to the movie, because you mentioned some people think it's like Christian propaganda or something. Just what was the range of opinions that you heard from people in response to the movie?
The reaction to the movie, I think, is really, really divisive. I think, people tend to either love it or hate it. It's, like if you go to on Rotten Tomatoes, 50% of people like it, 50% of people don't. And that may or may not be because it's a good movie or a bad movie. I think it's something to do with the fact that I think anytime you deal with religion, people instantly kind of already have their kind of preconceived notions that they bring into the conversation. And that's interesting. And it's part of what the audience reaction to the movie, I think, to some extent brought out what the theme of the film was, which was, two people can read the Bible and take two completely different things from it. It's all subjective. And there's no, truly objective view of faith. And I think people that were Christian really came to the movie and embraced it. I got so many messages through Facebook and email and different places from people who are, really deeply religious and take their faith very seriously, for whom the film was really profound. And they felt like the movie spoke to them very deeply. They saw it as a very, a positive affirmation of their faith. And though I'm not a person of faith myself, I take tremendous, satisfaction in knowing that the movie worked for them on that level. People who are atheist or more cynical about religion saw it as Christian propaganda and were less likely to embrace it, which is weird because, again, I'm an atheist myself, and the point of the movie was not to try and promote Christian ideology or to say that God is real. I think in the fictional universe of this movie, God is real. I think that's really the only reading of the film that makes any sense. It's impossible, I think, for Eli to kind of do the things that he does and for his journey to end the way that it does, unless you subscribe to the notion that in the fictional universe of this film, there is actually a real God watching over him. But, I've also written movies about vampires and aliens. I don't necessarily believe that vampires and aliens are real either. To me, it's just another very interesting fictional mythology on which to base the film.
Right. I mean, I'm not religious at all, and I tend to be hostile to religious films like that. But I really like the Book of Eli. I thought the supernatural elements, as it were understated enough that I just enjoyed it as a science fiction movie.
Yeah, it tries not to, rub it in your face. I think, if you do kind of respond to the faith-based aspects of it, I do think there's an extra level there for you. Like, again, I don't think it's a coincidence that people of faith are the ones that seem to like the movie the most, even though, again, the movie tries to take a very neutral view of this, even though I think by the end it ends in this kind of very affirming way for Eli, and his faith in God is kind of validated at the end. The movie spends a lot of time, through Gary Oldman's character to some degree, talking about how religion can be really damaging and dangerous. And the backstory of the movie is basically, there was just kind of these religious wars that destroyed the world. And part of the reason why the Bibles had all been wiped out is because people recognized it as one of the reasons why the world had gone to shit. And that's why it was very important to us that when, at the end of the movie and the book that Eli's carrying ends up on the shelf, that wasn't like a temple or a religious place, that it was really just another, historical, it had historical interest of, wow, people really believe this stuff. And as we rebuild our civilization, it's going to be interesting for us to know all the different things that people believed in in the world that came before. Not necessarily saying that we're going to ascribe to those same beliefs, but even if you just look at it as a cautionary tale, wow, we used to believe this crazy stuff and look what it did to the world. I think that's, it speaks to that kind of old idea of if you don't, know the historical mistakes of the past, you're condemned to repeat them.
Right. Well, one thing you said that I thought was really interesting is you said that Glenn Beck really liked the movie, and that you see him more as kind of like a Gary Oldman character type person.
Yeah, I had read somewhere, I don't know if I ever saw it directly, but I had read somewhere that Glenn Beck was a big fan of the film. And again, it was very much embraced by people on the right, again, kind of Christian conservatives and kind of fundamentalist type people. And I thought in Glenn Beck's case, it was particularly interesting because the Gary Oldman character, Carnegie, was very much modeled on people like Glenn Beck, people whom, kind of the TV evangelists that you see on TV late at night or on Sunday mornings who, I think a lot of those people are snake oil salesmen. I think they've basically identified and are exploiting people's genuine faith or their search, their desire to believe in something greater than them. They've identified very cleverly that as a way to make money out of those people. And I think that's very cynical. I think it's quite evil and dangerous. And Carnegie was really kind of meant to symbolize that idea. And we had to lose, a lot of scenes, as you often do in the making of a film. Originally, in my early drafts, Carnegie was much more of a showman. Like, he would actually go out on to the balcony and address the town and kind of sound very much like, a TV evangelist or a Glenn Beck type person, kind of pretending to be this person that, is a believer in this faith so that he can motivate these people to do what they want. I remember Alan Hughes telling me that there's a little monologue at halfway through the movie where Gary Oldman basically talks about how the Bible is not just a book. It's a weapon, that can be used to exploit people and control people and make them do what you want to do. Because, his belief is that people that are attracted to religious faith are often people that are somewhat desperate, who aren't necessarily strong-minded. Again, I don't necessarily believe that, but I think there are people that do believe that and have used it, very successfully to enrich themselves. And Carnegie, the Gary Oldman character, is in many ways, I think, someone like Glenn Beck. So I just thought it was particularly ironic that Glenn Beck kind of, as I heard it, saw the movie and liked it without recognizing that the movie was supposed to be criticizing people like him.
Yeah. Okay, I also wanted to talk to you about this other recent big science fiction movie that you were involved with, After Earth. Do you want to just say kind of what your experience on that movie was like?
Yeah, I guess, it's interesting. When I finished on Eli, I remember sitting in the edit bay and they showed me the cut of the movie for the first time. And I literally was so overwhelmed at the end of the first time that I saw the film. Not because, I think the film is tremendously emotionally powerful, and I'm kind of immune to it, because I wrote it. So it's not like the movie has the same effects on me that it might on someone else who doesn't know what's going to happen next. But I was so, it was such a culmination of a dream for me to write this movie and then see it kind of writ large on a screen, and it was true to the script. I mean, they changed very little about the script that I wrote. And it's very rare in this business to write a script that sells and then actually see it made with, major actors, people are, on the level of Denzel Washington and Gary Oldman. And then also to see it produced in a way that's basically faithful to what you wrote. Oftentimes when you work on a movie, it gets all kind of bent and pushed and pulled out of shape by all the various people, all the egos, producers, directors, actors, people on the film who basically are more powerful than you, because everyone on a film is more powerful than the writer. That it's really, just a crapshoot whether or not, when you get into this business, if you're ever going to produce anything that finds its way to an audience in a way that is indicative of what you originally set out to do. And Eli is very much that. I watched the movie and I was like, my God, they filmed the movie that I wrote. This is almost exactly what I had in my head, writ large on a screen with Oscar-winning actors. But it's even greater than I could imagine because, the Hughes brothers, made it look beautiful, and it was, so much more artistically, just pretty, and the Atticus Ross, but this beautiful soundtrack on it, that by the end of it, I just cried because the emotion of seeing this dream realized was so, was just so resonant. It was so emotionally affecting to me. But I remember thinking shortly afterwards, this is it. This is the one that you get. Like, you've played your Joker really early in your career. You've had a movie made based on your original idea that's faithful to your original vision, and it's really good. This never happens. So the fact that it's happened once means that it's probably never going to. That's probably it. It's never going to happen again. And so, off the strength of Eli, I got hired to go work on After Earth, which was his original idea that Will Smith had. And I got to say, I had a tremendous time working on that film. I love Will. I got to hang out with Will, for weeks at a time. He's one of the greatest people I've ever met in this business. I love working with him. I got to work with M. Night Shyamalan, who I think is also just a totally lovely guy. Enjoyed really working with him. I had a tremendous experience working on the film. But it was one of those ones where, unlike Eli, where it was basically just kind of me from beginning to end, there was another writer that kind of came and went on Eli. But, I ended up with sole credit on the film, and the film is kind of 90% what I wrote. with After Earth, that was kind of more the typical Hollywood process, where I wrote a draft of the script, and then other writers came on after me, and Knight, because he's a writer-director, ended up rewriting a bunch of stuff. And by the time I saw the film that came out the other end, I didn't recognize it the same way that I recognized, Eli when I had written that, because the film had gone through a lot of developmental changes. And, while the basic structure and story of the film is the same thing that that Will and I had originally developed together, I think, there were so many other, minds and opinions and egos and whatever you want to call it that ended up affecting what movie came out at the end of that process. I looked at it, I was like, yeah, I remember that bit and that bit, but like the film wasn't what I originally thought it was going to be. And that's not to say I think it's a terrible film. I actually think it's a better film than the reviews suggested, because I think, between Knight and Jaden Smith, there was just too many like really soft targets for the press to go on. It was just too easy for them to attack that film. So I don't think it's as bad as the critics. I still hear from people all the time that really like it.
Right. No, I totally agree with you about critics being hard on the film. I mean, I just saw that it was 11% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I never watched it. But in preparation for this interview, my girlfriend and I just watched it 2 nights ago.
Oh, wow. You took a bullet.
I mean, we both felt that it was, I was expecting it to be just ghastly. And I thought it was okay. I mean, I was really stunned by the degree to which it failed to be horrible.
Yeah, and like I said, I think we live in this kind of media culture right now, especially on the internet, where there's so much snark and people seem to delight so much in tearing things down. I mean, we see this all the time. When something falls short of expectations, the media descends upon it just like a pack of vultures, and I find it really disheartening. And in the case of After Earth, like I said, I look at that film, and from someone who saw it from the inside out, I can see the flaws and I can see the parts that work and the parts that don't work. But I can ultimately say, yeah, I think ultimately there was a better version of this film conceptually than ultimately was able to make it through, the rigmarole and the various roller coaster rides that are a typical, film development process. But I don't think it's as bad as all that. I still hear from people that really enjoy it, particularly it's like dads of kids really like it, because the thing that I always liked about it was really just meant to be, aside from, kind of the evolved animals and the kind of crazy monsters that are chasing you around and stuff like that, what always attracted me to it and what Will originally wanted to do was just a movie about an estranged father and a son who, through this experience that they went through, kind of learned, finally found a way to reconnect as a father and a son. And I think the movie to some extent manages to achieve that. But it's not, I think, what people necessarily want from a Will Smith movie. Will was very determined to play this part very seriously and be this very buttoned down, very kind of dour military dad. And I think so many people these days just want Will to be, Men in Black Will, oh, hell no. Like they want that guy. And he made a decision to try and do something different. And I just don't think audiences at large, really responded to it.
Yeah, I mean, I liked that, though. And I mean, I may be a sympathetic audience for this movie, because it really reminded me of sort of a Heinlein Juvenile, like Tunnel in the Sky, the kind of stuff I grew up reading. And, it was an okay, example of that sort of movie. And
like I said, at the end of the day, I had a tremendous experience where everything is a learning experience, right? So I learned a lot about, navigating the politics and the diplomacy of working on a big movie like that, where the studio's got a lot of money on the line, and there are a lot of people with, their own agendas and their own egos. When you're dealing with Knight and Will, these are a lot of people that are these are people that are used to, the movie being what they want it to be. And, when there's so many different cooks in the kitchen, I think that can often be to the detriment of a project.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said there are bits of the movie that you can kind of recognize as things you did. Is there anything you could point to and say, oh, yeah, that's something that was my idea?
Yeah, I mean, the spaceship crash is very much mine. Some of the, I would say just kind of the overall bones of what the movie is, the way that the ship crashes and the experience they go through afterwards. A lot of that came from Will. He had a kind of a general idea of what he wanted the kind of the main structure of the film would be, but I helped him flesh that out, and most of that is still there. All the stuff about kind of the Ranger School and the war that exists between mankind and the aliens in the future, and what the evolved version of Earth would look like. There's little things that I added, just kind of the little geothermal hotspots that he has to reach every evening because the jungle kind of freezes over at night and things like that. A lot of little almost kind of video gamey type things that I was able to add that I felt helped the movie move along, but. There's almost no, like, for example, there's almost none of my dialogue left in the film at all. I mean, it's like literally I can point to like one line here or there, but that's the kind of stuff that tends to get rewritten the most when you get rewritten by other writers.
How about the idea of the alien that senses fear and the details about how people can overcome their fears? Is that something that was kind of in play when you were working on the script?
I came up with the idea for the Ursa, which was this, the idea of a creature that had been kind of genetically engineered to hunt humans, and it was specifically bred by these aliens for that purpose. In terms of the fear thing, I'll give you one example, like the whole big, danger is real, fear is a choice, which kind of turned into a tagline in the movie, and that big speech that Will gives, about how, you must control your fear. That's all like long after I left. I don't even know who wrote that. There were other writers uncredited that came and went on the movie after me as well. So I think that stuff's really cool, but I don't take any credit for it. The basic structure of Jaden's character, having to fight that thing at the end and fire off the beacon, all of that stuff was in my draft of the script. But the context of learning to kind of basically, this idea of this beast that would hunt you by making you afraid and then tracking you, the pheromones that you secrete when you are. I actually think that stuff's all very clever, but that was all developed after I left.
Yeah, no, I thought that stuff was all cool. I really like the trailer for this movie. So, if nothing else, people should check out the trailer.
Yeah, just watch the trailer. Much quicker, and it's free.
All right, so let's talk about your new novel, Abomination. Tell us about how this project's come about.
Well, so this is actually an interesting segue from what we were just talking about. One of the things that I have learned from 15 years or so of working as a screenwriter in this business is that as a writer, you are often not someone who has much control or much say or much equity in terms of what the finished product is going to be. With Eli, I just got lucky. I sold that script. And again, you've got to remember, once you sell it, I often tell this to writers, once you sell a script, that's it. You've sold it. It's like selling anything. Like if I sell you my car and you pay me money for the car and you become the legal owner of the car, you can then do whatever you want with it. I no longer have any right to say to you, well, don't repaint it, or don't drive it over the speed limit, or don't drive it off a cliff. You have the right to do all those things if you want, because you now own it. And the same is true with a script. If you sell an original piece of material to a studio, contractually, they are obliged to allow you you have to have first refusal on doing the first rewrite of the script. But after that, they can fire you. They can bring on other writers. They can do whatever they want, even if you stay on the movie, stars and producers and directors will often have more equity and more of a say and more of an ability to affect what the finished product is than you do as a writer. So with Abomination, the original idea for that story was I would do it as a movie. But I remember looking at this idea and thinking, well, here's all the reasons why if I write this as a movie script, a studio's probably going to say no to it. It's a period piece. It'd be relatively expensive to do because it has all these kind of crazy monster effects and big battle scenes and stuff like that. It's set in 9th century England, which, a lot of studios will tell you, oh, we're never going to make money. No one's going to come see that movie. So there's a good chance that I could write that movie, spend 6 months, putting, all my blood, sweat and tears into it. And studios would just say no, and it's just not going to get made. And nobody reads scripts outside of Hollywood. So you've spent a lot of time writing this story that maybe 20 or 30 people would ever see. And, for a writer, that's very disheartening. What you want to do when you write something is have people see and enjoy it and get that satisfaction. And so it occurred to me that there was maybe another way to get this story told in a way that I'm completely in control of it, and that's to write it as a novel. When you write a movie script, you don't really have a finished product. You have the blueprint for what you hope one day will become a finished product if enough people come along and all agree to make it. But when you have the manuscript for a novel, you essentially do have a finished product, and you don't even need a publisher anymore. I look at writers like Hugh Howey and Andy Weir, who have circumvented the traditional publishing model completely and found tremendous success just putting their books directly on Amazon and talking directly to their audience, and basically bypassing all the traditional gatekeepers that we associate with book publishing. So I thought, well, I can at least do that. Like, even if I can't find, even if there's like a publisher that doesn't want to take the book on, I've got enough of a following on social media and people that, have responded to my work in the past that I could probably put this on Amazon. I could self-publish it and, bang the drum and promote it myself and get, some people to read it. And maybe it takes off, maybe it doesn't. But I know at least that the version of the story that I put out there is the one that I wanted to tell. And nobody fired me, nobody rewrote me, nobody forced me to change the story into something I didn't want it to be. So I did it kind of as an experiment. It was a way, sometimes when you get, the same thing happened on Eli, when you're really possessed by a story and you just love the idea, and even if it's not the most commercial idea, or if it's something that you think, no one's ever going to buy this, when you've got one of those ideas that just won't let you sleep at night, sometimes the only way to kind of get it out of your system is to write it out. And so I wrote Abomination just kind of in my free time over the course of, I think, 2 years, there was like 6 months where I didn't even touch it. I had to set it aside because I was working on other things. But whenever I wasn't, occupied by, whatever paid writing I'd been hired to do, I would write another chapter of Abomination here or there. And I finally had a draft of it that I was going to self-publish. We eventually did end up finding a publisher for it. But like I said, the plan was just to originally self-publish it.
Right, and the publisher Inkshares, it's sort of an interesting hybrid of self-publishing and traditional publishing.
Yeah, I really liked them. It's, again, it was kind of a really interesting, it's almost like a Goldilocks story of like the porridge is too hot, porridge is too cold, this one is just right. I had initially approached, what we think of as the traditional publishers, about Abomination. And a couple of people read it and said, we like this book, we just have no idea how to market it. Because it is this kind of like weird mashup of like, is it horror? Is it fantasy? Is it historical? Because, there's elements of, English history. It's not set in kind of a magical kingdom. It's set, in 9th century England, but there's magic and there's monsters and there's also these really horrific elements. So in terms of like what shelf you put it on, I think traditional publishers that need to be able to very easily kind of categorize their books in order to market them and know how to sell them, didn't know quite what to make of it. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll just self-publish it. That's what I was going to do anyway. And I looked into self-publishing, and I did have some very educational calls with people like Hugh Howey and Andy Weir, who've had tremendous success with books, like Wool and The Martian. And they did go the traditional straight-up self-publishing route. They wrote the books, they put them on Amazon, they published them on their own websites, and they just, because those stories were really good, they just kind of went viral. People responded to them, they started sharing them with friends, and that's the kind of, self-publishing success that you can find these days. And so I had looked into that. I was talking to Hugh and Andy because I was going to go in that direction. I was asking them, like, what can I learn from your experience, having published these books? What would your do's and don'ts be? And they gave me a bunch of great advice, and I was looking into self-publishing it. So, I would hire an editor and pay them to, go through the manuscript and make corrections and suggest notes. I would hire a cover artist and, do all that kind of stuff. And I knew that I could, to some extent leverage whatever my profile is as a writer to promote it and help it find an audience. And then I discovered through my agent this company called Inkshares, who are kind of like Kickstarter for books, I guess, in that, you can submit your book idea to them and they'll put it up on their website and, there's a little presentation. Here's, read a sample chapter. Here's a little video of me talking about what the book is or what the book's going to be. And if enough people, like the idea, they can go onto the website and pre-order the book ahead of time. And Inkshares has a very specific algorithm where they figure out, okay, if we hit this funding number, we can, that covers our costs in terms of, printing and publishing and distributing, so many copies of the book. And so we crowdfunded Abomination that way, and we hit our number. And we were able to publish the book. And in the end, it's, I think, been a really good experience because it does have a lot of the benefits of self-publishing. As a writer, I think I probably had more creative control over the book, not just what's inside the pages, but also what's on the cover and how it's marketed. Really kind of across the board, I felt like I had a lot of say in how the book was produced, perhaps more so than I might have with a traditional publisher. But at the same time, Inkshares does also bring a lot of stuff to the table that as a self-published author, you might not have, marketing the book and coming up with cover artwork and editing it and promoting it and distributing all that stuff. That's a lot of work for a self-published author. It's why a lot of self-published authors, don't find successes because they're not willing or not able to do all the stuff they need to do to make their book look attractive and to find an audience. Inkshares does all of that for you. And so it was really a great mix of, like I said, the creative freedom that I would associate with self-publishing, but a lot of the benefits that a traditional publisher have as well.
Right. Now, so when a lot of my friends do crowdfunding campaigns like Kickstarters, it's like a full-time job for them for that month to get the word out about the Kickstarter. Did you do anything like that, or did you just kind of put the page up and let nature take its course?
No, a little bit. We kind of, it's interesting. We had kind of two rounds of promotion in that when the Kickstarter, I say Kickstarter, sorry, when the Inkshares page first went up, you typically have, I think, 45 days to hit your funding goal. And it's not a tremendously high number. The reality is to print and publish and produce a certain number of books is really not that expensive. But you do have to hit that number, and you're given 45 days to do it. We actually hit our number in 20 hours, which was terrific. And that was partly because I went out, of my own volition. So, okay, I have these Twitter followers. I have, some profile from the movies that I've worked on, and people know who I am. And I'm going to go out there and just basically bang the drum as loudly as I can. And I, did interviews with websites, and, I promoted the hell out of it on Twitter and on Facebook. And I just did everything I could to direct people to that page and to ask them to, back the book or pre-order the book so that we could hit that number. And so we got it over the number. And at that point, the book's going to be made. So that's really cool. And then, that was in February, and then the book actually does go into, final copy edits, and you produce the cover art, and, you print all the copies and you distribute them. And then once you actually get to publication day, you kind of have to go back out and do it all over again. So I just did another round of publicity just recently where, now the book's actually out there in the shops. You're trying to get people to, buy it and read it or whatever. So I ended up doing kind of two rounds of publicity on it.
And you mentioned the cover art. I just want to mention that this is a really physically nice looking book. I mean, it looks as good as any other book from any traditional publisher. The cover art's gorgeous and the production values are great. So
yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and that people do seem to pick up on that. I've seen a lot of self-published books, and you can publish them. Amazon has a system called CreateSpace that will allow you to self-publish a book, not just as like a digital, Kindle type edition, an ebook, but also as an actual physical book that Amazon will print on demand and send to people who order it. But unless you're really, really willing to put a ton of work into the design of the book, and there are some people that have done this, it's unlikely to produce the kind of result that you would think, okay, this looks like a quote unquote real book. Like this is the kind of thing that if you walked into Barnes and Noble, you would see, put on that front table. A lot of them look, kind of crappy, and I didn't want that. I think people do largely still judge books by their covers. And I said to Inkshares at the very beginning of our collaboration, guys, I don't even know what this really means. You know it when you see it, but I want this to look like a quote unquote proper book. And so, and again, I got to pick my own cover artist, Jason Gurley, who's a tremendously talented artist, agreed to do the cover art for us. And Inkshares went all, they did a beautiful hardback edition. And again, it's a lot of it is like really just little details. We got to pick, the particular kind of paper stock and the typography and all those little things that, again, you don't necessarily understand what it is, but your brain just knows when you see the finished product, yeah, this is a real book.
Right. No, it looks, like I said, it looks just terrific.
Yeah, they did a great job with it.
You mentioned that the story takes place in 9th century England. Did you really, I don't know, how much research did you do into that time period? Did you really immerse yourself in, history things to write the book?
I did a fair amount. I didn't feel like I needed to do a ton because the historical part of it is really just the backdrop. The first couple of chapters of the book do have quite a bit of historical detail to kind of set the scene. It's a really fascinating time in history, during the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe just kind of descended into absolute chaos. The Roman Empire was essentially what kept Europe, a lawful and orderly society. And then when they left, when the empire collapsed, Europe basically just descended into absolute, feudal chaos. And so it was a very kind of dark time in English history, particularly for England, because we were under constant Viking invasion, and for hundreds of years we were desperately trying to prevent the Vikings from taking over the whole country. And Alfred the Great essentially was charged with defending the last English kingdom that remained that hadn't been occupied and conquered by the Vikings. So it's a really, really interesting period in history, and I did a certain amount of research into making sure that kind of just the backdrop and the basic historical details, dates and battles and places and what territory was occupied by the Vikings. That I think is all mostly historically accurate. But then once the story gets going, the historical foundation of it doesn't really matter so much. It's kind of a more traditional kind of fantasy, monster and magic type story after that point.
Right. And I know you mentioned, I think, that you grew up in England. Did that influence this book at all? I mean, are you familiar with any of the geography and things featured in this book?
Yeah, I mean, we learn all this stuff in school. One of the things about English history classes, there's an awful lot of it you have to learn. We have this massively long and quite turbulent history, and I remember learning about the Viking invasions and Alfred the Great when I was a kid at school. And again, as an English person myself, I'm often drawn back to those themes. I've written kind of World War II stories that are very specifically set from the English point of view. I've got a comic book I'm working on right now, which is another thing set in England with English characters. Like I'm always going to have I think where I come from is always going to be a part of the stuff that I create. And the idea with Abomination was partly born out of that process, but also I liked the idea of telling a story again in a real time and place. And there's a lot of fantasy fiction out there these days. It's very, very crowded marketplace. I think more so than ever in this kind of post Game of Thrones world that we live in now. And everyone's got their own version of Westeros or Middle Earth or Shannara. There's kind of these great fantasy kingdoms. And I felt like it might be more interesting, or at least interesting in a different way, to tell a story with fantasy elements, with magic and with monsters and all this cool stuff, but ground it in a real historical time and place, because then I didn't have to worry about creating all this fictionalized mythology. Like the history was already there to tell me what the map of the world looked like. And also it helps, I think, to some extent, make the more fantastical elements of the story feel more grounded, because you don't feel like you're in a faraway imaginary place. You're in a place that This is why the first couple of chapters of the book go to great lengths to try and establish this. This is a real period in history. All of this stuff really happened. England really was split down the middle, with the Vikings basically occupying pretty much all of eastern England, and there was very little real English territory left, and there were these tremendous battles that were being fought. That is I think as interesting as anything that's in Game of Thrones, but it all really happened.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to give too much away, but this story has a really interesting structure to it. I was just wondering, is there anything you want to say about the structure of the story?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that this actually goes back to the question of like why write it as a book instead of a movie. A lot of people have said that the story in some ways reads a little bit like a screenplay, that it has kind of this cinematic vibe to it, and I'm sure that's because of my background as a screenwriter. But part of the reason why I wanted to pursue it as a book instead of as a movie is because the way that I wanted to tell the story didn't necessarily conform to what at times are the very rigid expectations of how a movie story is structured. It's a 3-act story. You escalate towards, a big, epic conclusion. And there are various things along the way that if you deviate from those guidelines, that can be just another reason for someone to say, no, I don't want to make this movie. I don't understand the way the story functions. So I knew that as a novel, I would have the ability to tell the story with, I think, more flexibility and not have to worry about a lot of the kind of the perceived prevailing wisdom of how a story is supposed to work. So the story does, as you mentioned, without giving too much away, there's like a really major turn that it takes, I think, like a third of the way through, where it's almost like that story ends and a whole other story begins. And I'm sure we're going to have this conversation at some point, I presume, about whether or not Abomination can or will be made into a film. And at that point, we'd probably have to figure out how to restructure the story to put it into more of a typical kind of movie screenplay 3-act structure template. But part of the fun of writing it as a book was not have to worry about that and just tell the story the way that I wanted to tell it. And I think it really pays off, because what happens is now people come to stories, especially movie stories, with such an expectation of how the story is going to play out, because there are so many specific and very strict rules about turning points and first act, second act, third act, and everything has to escalate, and it can become quite predictable. That one of the most satisfying things for me is people who have read the book coming back and saying, wow, I didn't expect that to happen, or this event really took me by surprise, because I gave myself the freedom to take turns and to make decisions in the story that, were I writing it as a movie, I may not have felt like I would have had the same freedom.
Right, right. And then another thing that really struck me in the book is that one of the protagonists, Wulfric, is a much more noble character than I feel like most characters in contemporary fiction are, or even in contemporary movies as well. We were talking about this recently on the show in terms of the Chris Pratt character in Jurassic World, that there just seems to be this tendency in modern movies to make the protagonist kind of a dick for no particular reason. And I was just wondering what you think about that, and do you feel like too many protagonists are dicks and you wanted to go in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's, especially in Hollywood, we're always chasing trends, and right now, I think for the longest, for a while now, we've been dealing with this idea that in order for these days, your protagonist has to be edgy, right? Like he can't just be like a good old fashioned hero character anymore. There has to be some dark side to him. And again, I think a lot of the time that can work. I mean, your Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy is kind of a dick, right? But that's part of why we love him, right? That's what makes him kind of a fun character. Ever since Han Solo, we've loved the idea of kind of rogues and scoundrels and characters who aren't necessarily, completely likable, but it's often the things that are less likable about them, ironically, that endears us to them all the more. I don't necessarily think that's the only way to write a character, though. I mean, I think it's really interesting. Right before we got on this podcast, I was watching Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I've got it on my office TV in the background, and that's a great example of how you can still do a terrific, good old fashioned kind of like all American, apple pie hero. I mean, Steve Rogers, right, in those movies is not morally ambiguous, right? He knows exactly what he stands for. He is just absolutely kind of true blue good guy. He's surrounded by people, like Tony Stark and Nick Fury, these other characters are much more morally ambiguous, and that's interesting in their own way. But I think Steve Rogers stands out in that group all the more because he is the one who's kind of like, ramrod straight. I know what I believe in. This is wrong. I'm not going to compromise. And I think that's kind of the genius of what they did with that Captain America character, is taking a character like that who is absolutely morally sure of himself and knows exactly where, right begins and wrong ends, and put him in a world where none of that stuff seems to matter anymore. And he's trying to stand up for something, with all these other people around him don't seem to give a shit. And I think that's really interesting. And I guess in kind of a different way, I like the idea of doing a character in Wulfric who was completely morally upstanding and knew exactly what he stood for, but in a way is like kind of almost a victim of his own moral rectitude, that he has such high standards for what he considers, what would make a good person, that he doesn't even think that he qualifies himself. And he's very, very deeply critical of himself, carries around a tremendous amount of guilt for the things that he did during the war. Because it's interesting. He's a pacifist. It's in many ways a war story, and Wulfric is kind of this great war hero. But he hates himself for all the things that he did in the war because he's a pacifist. I'm very pacifistic, very, very anti-war. I think anytime that we can tell anti-war stories or stories that don't glamorize war or make it seem fun or cool or sexy, I think we're doing something worthwhile. And the battle scenes and the stuff that touches on the Viking Wars and Abomination is meant to be absolutely horrible. Like, you would never want to live in this world. And I think Wulfric is someone who's never asked for that for himself. He's not a warrior by choice. He kind of got conscripted and forced to do this, and did the things that he had to do in order to survive and to protect, his king and his kingdom. But now after that, I think carries around a tremendous amount of guilt for the things that he's done. And a lot of the narrative or emotional thrust of the narrative is really meant to be about him learning to accept the person that he is and forgive himself in a way for the things that he's done.
Yeah. And so I mentioned Wulfric is one of the protagonists. And again, I don't want to say too much, but the other main protagonist in the novel is Indra. Is there anything you want to say about her as a character?
With Indra, it was just, I always knew that I wanted it to be kind of dual protagonists. And I wanted to, I always knew that one was Wulfric, but I wanted to give him a really good female character to kind of bounce off as well. And this is something I've thought about and talked about a lot recently in writing the book and doing interviews about it. I think there's been a really, and there's been a lot of confusion in the last few years about what constitutes a strong female character. And I think, it's great that we're having these discussions. I think it's terrific that, women are finally kind of getting their due as, in popular culture, right? We have an all-women Ghostbusters movie coming out. I think that, I don't care what the complainers say, that is fantastic, and it's long overdue. I'm very, very proud of the fact that I worked on a Star Wars movie that has a female protagonist at the heart of that. And Force Awakens has a very strong female character at the heart of that in Daisy Ridley. So this is now, I think we're now starting to finally see, I think, a much greater gender equity in terms of who we accept as our movie heroes. It doesn't always have to be, Chuck Norris and Bruce Willis anymore. I think there's much more gender neutrality now, and I think that's long overdue. I think part of getting there, though, is working through our conceptions or our misconceptions of what constitutes like a strong female hero or a good female protagonist. I think a lot of people, when they talk about creating strong female characters, often think that means they often I think have a very simplistic interpretation of it, which is to say this is someone who's really tough, this is someone who's kick-ass, this is someone who basically has a lot of masculine characteristics, someone who can fight her way out of a situation. I don't necessarily think a man who can fight his way out of a situation is particularly strong, just because they're good with their fists or with a gun or something. I don't think necessarily makes them a strong character. So I don't know why necessarily just assigning those traits to a woman, other than the fact that we don't necessarily automatically assign those traits to female characters as much, automatically makes her a strong or an interesting character in the same way. And so Indra was kind of my way of trying to figure out like what I thought we meant when we talked about a strong female character. And, in many of the conventional ways that I just talked about, she does have those qualities. She is good with a sword. She does stand up for herself. She is kind of strong in those kind of typical masculine ways. But I thought what was much more interesting about her and what makes her a much stronger character is I really tried to kind of load her down with as many emotional flaws and problems and setbacks as possible. She had a terrible childhood. She hates her dad. She was terribly mistreated by her dad. She suffers from debilitating panic attacks. She lies. She's arrogant. She's carrying around all this unresolved anger that often leads her to get into trouble and act out in ways that, are contrary to her goals. So she's got all these emotional and psychological problems that I think make it very difficult for her to succeed. And so I think what makes a character strong like that, whether it be male or female, is rather than start them, on the goal line where, they're basically an okay character and off they go on their mission, start them 20 yards back, weigh them down with as much emotional baggage and as many problems as you possibly can, and then ask them to overcome those flaws and succeed in spite of all of them. Because I think if you can do that, that's much more of a struggle. In Abomination, she has to fight monsters and bad guys and all this kind of stuff externally that she has to overcome. But I think what's much more interesting is the internal struggle and her inner demons and these voices inside her head that tell her that she's going to fail and she's not good enough, and all the things that, that kind of plague us, in our daily lives, our inner critic, that voice that's telling us that we're all imposters who aren't worthy. I think what I found ultimately that was most interesting was the more problems I gave her and the more things that I kind of burdened her with, and the more setbacks I gave her, the stronger she became, because she had to become stronger in order to get where I needed her to go, which is, hopefully a happy resolution for her by the end of the story.
Yeah. All right, so unfortunately, we're running really short on time here. I wanted to note one thing, though, is that this book has one of the most eclectic collections of blurbs I've ever seen. You've got video game designers, film producers, podcasters, novelists. I mean, some of these people are Cliff Bleszinski and Gail Ann Hurd, Nicole Perlman. It's just, I think it really speaks to how wide-ranging your creative work has been. But are these all people you know? How did you end up with all these crazy?
Yeah, to some extent. I don't have a copy of the book in front of me right now for all of them, but yeah, you're right. It is kind of an eclectic mix. Typically, when you see blurbs on the back of a book, from a writer who's, a lot of people these days, they're writers that have written other books, you tend to get blurbs from other writers, and from the literary press. Though I have a background in screenwriting and a profile as a writer in film, none of that really parlays into my work as an author. I do now because I've been through this experience, but when I first started writing it, I didn't know any authors. I didn't really know anyone who would be appropriate to put on the book, as a blurb. So I just kind of reached out. I sent free copies of the book to the people that I did know. And those are people from the world of video games, people from the world of film, fellow screenwriters, film producers, and in the end, some of the authors that I came to know during this process. People like Chuck Wendig and Hugh Howey, who were kind enough to, Adam Christopher, people who are authors of note, who were happy and read the book and were liked it enough that they're comfortable giving a blurb. But you're right, it's an eclectic mix, and it does kind of, I guess, in a way, reflect kind of the weird routes that I took towards getting to write this book.
Yeah, I mean, have any of the responses really struck you, been really interesting or noteworthy that you've gotten to the book?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that that the book seems to have done successfully, that what I would hoped it would do. Anytime that you write something, whether it be the overall work or maybe a specific moment or a line in a scene or something, there are times when you go like, this is going to kill. Like, I really, really think, or I really hope that the audience is going to respond to this. Like, here's a twist in the story that I put, or just a little character moment or a gag, and you just, you have a good feeling about it, and you just hope that it's going to go over the way that you expect it to or the way you hope it will. With Abomination, there were just two things that I kind of hoped it would do. One was really gross people out, because I wanted to, just on a popcorn level, part of it was an exercise in, can I create monsters and monster scenes that are so gut-wrenchingly just sickening and disgusting and awful. I was really influenced by John Carpenter's The Thing. You know, if you've read the book, obviously you'll probably see some of that influence. Just wanted to create just these awful, just absolutely unholy, abominable, unspeakable things that just have no business existing in the real world, and try to paint that picture, you know, with words as effectively as possible, that people would just be like really grossed out. And I think that's worked. I've got a lot of comments from people going, "Oh my God, this is disgusting! Like, what the fuck is wrong with you?" Like, that's exactly the kind of stuff that you want to hear. And then just on a larger scale, you know, just hoping that the for all its kind of popcorn sensibilities, like, it is gross, it's supposed to be violent, it's supposed to be scary, it's supposed to be ugly in places, it's supposed to be very visceral, but there is kind of ultimately beneath it is meant to be hopefully kind of a sweet and emotionally kind of redemptive story that along the way takes a couple of unexpected turns. And again, for the most part, people seem to have responded to that. They've identified that even though it's really gross on the surface, it's actually kind of sweet underneath and emotionally resonant. And in a couple of specific places, the story does turn in a way that people don't expect. I've got so many, it's funny, it's almost become like a meme now. I've had so many people come to me saying, "Oh my God, I just read chapter 8. And they're just like speechless, or, you know, "You motherfucker," or whatever. They just like really unhappy about chapter 8, but in a good way, because something really surprising and quite bad happens in chapter 8 that you don't see coming, I think, for the most part. And when people get there, it really kind of throws them because it's just not something they're expecting to happen. Again, because I think I was able to structure the story in a way that that was, I guess, to some extent non-conformist and non-traditional, and so unexpected.
I agree with that. Yeah, the book definitely took me by surprise more than once, for sure.
Good, I'm glad.
And I think we'll probably have to wrap things up there. So just to finally, Gary, do you just want to have any other projects you want to mention? Anything else you just want to let people know about?
Yeah, let me see. I'm doing, I almost wish you were talking to me like a week later, because there's a couple of things I'm really excited about that are not announced yet, but will be very soon. But I'm doing, right now I'm finishing up a movie for Fox called Starlight, which is an adaptation of the Mark Millar comic book. You know, Mark did Kingsman: Secret Service and Kick-Ass and Wanted and a bunch of cool comic books that got turned into movies. And this is the next one that we're hoping will go into production next year. I've got 2 other movie and TV projects, which I can't announce yet. And I'm doing a comic book called Oliver, which is a post-apocalyptic retelling of the Oliver Twist story, which is going to be published next year. So talk to me again in a couple of weeks, and I'll tell you stuff that's cool that I can't talk about yet.
All right, sounds good. All right, so we've been speaking with Gary Whitta, and this new book is called Abomination. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Gary Whitta for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Bulgud Munson in Norway, and Magic Cooper, No Broccoli in the Burrito, and Sean Mack the Don in the US. No Broccoli in the Burrito writes, "This podcast is great. Depth, detail, and excellent topics. Thank you for creating this. I have to imagine that someone should be able to monetize this podcast properly, given that nearly every podcast drives me to see the movies and purchase the books that are showcased. Okay, fine, I go to the library too. Thanks for a great show." So big thanks again to No Broccoli in the Burrito for that great review. Special thanks as well to Ben Symes, Samuel Corpy, and Francisco Morera, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. I'd also like to give a special thank you to longtime listener Estelle Tidy, who just increased her Patreon pledge to $2 per episode. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you prefer to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to thank Victor Thorin in Norway, who just became PayPal patron number 119. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.